Thanks, everybody. If you could please take your seats again. We're now moving to the first panel discussion, which we'll very much try to keep live by your questions. We'll just start off with some initial remarks by the speakers. The theme for this panel is enabling transformational adaptation in the primary sector, possible, plausible, preferable, ? The panelists are Nick Cradock-Henry, John Reed, Jenny Christie, and Rod Oram. So slight change in the program because Meg Parsons, who we plan to have on the panel, unfortunately also got COVID, but we were very lucky to have Jenny Christie instead. Nick is the principal scientist, social scientist with GNS Science and co-leader of Resilience Policy and Governance for Resilience to Nature's Challenges, National Climate Change Challenge. John leads research programs at the Naitau Centre at the University of Canterbury to solve complex socioeconomic problems by utilizing systems thinking and indigenous wisdom traditions. Jenny is principal scientist, climate impacts at the Ministry for the Environment, with an extensive background in climate adaptation at central government level, having worked previously with the Department of Conservation, where she developed DOCS adaptation and research plans. And you've already heard from Rod, and more details are again available via the QR codes. So what we want to discuss in this panel is, based on what you know, based on what research has shown, is incorporating adaptation into business as usual, the way we've been doing it, going to be enough? If not, why not, and how can we do better? So I'll ask each of you to start with just a couple of minutes each, but just putting out your key thoughts, and then we get into conversation based on the question that you feed us. So Nick, let's start with you. You've been working on this in a long time.
Thanks very much, Andy. Probably about 10 years ago now, I remember visiting a farming family in the Bay of Plenty, and they described how they had, it was several farms owned by the same family. One brother ran one unit, another brother ran the next. And he described how they had made a decision to basically shift from a very high intensive system where they were bringing in lots of supplemental feed to essentially a biodynamic system. So he was very experimental. He was testing new approaches. And in so doing, they had reduced their labor costs. They were spending more time as a family. And he said, you know, it came with some trade-offs. And he said something that stuck with me ever since. And he said, he tells his kids, you can have anything you want, you just can't have it all. And in thinking about the theme of this session, anything is possible. So transformational adaptation is possible. However, it won't just happen. It will require interventions. It will require research. And it will happen, as we heard from Lauren and from Anne, the national adaptation plan, the national risk assessments are useful, but we need to ground this in places and specific problems. Second, it's plausible. But is it plausible to think that adaptation will happen without trade-offs? And there, too, the role of research to identify what those potential trade-offs are. What are the synergies? Where can we realize opportunities? And again, this linked-up systems perspective can help us to identify where those things might occur. And finally, what is preferable? Tools do change, priorities change. And so this farmer talked about how they were no longer necessarily chasing production. They weren't trying to be the farm that produced the most number of milk solids per year. Instead, for him, the family's values had changed, and they actually wanted to see healthy soil. In the wine industry last week, we heard about how there's been a shift in attitudes towards away from sort of the scorched earth between vines to now having cover crops. And actually that provides values in terms of buffering capacity for water as well as local biodiversity. And that's a shift in norms, that's a shift in preferences that has happened. So none of these things are fixed. And then again, the role of research and researchers is potentially not to advocate for what those solutions might be in terms of adaptation, but simply to identify what are the options, where are there trade-offs, and for society to actually discuss what do we want, what do we prefer, what do we choose.
Yeah, well, ngā mihi ni, o ngā mihi nui ki koutou, koutou mihi ki ngā tuahuriri, te mana whenua te rohi nei, hei huri au no Ngāti Piki o mei Tainui, ko John Reed Topa Winoa. tātou katoa. I just want to begin by drawing on Māori mythology. And according to that mythology, societies are kind of pulled in two different directions. On one hand, we've got traditionalists and conservatives that preserve the status quo, and then we have disruptors and creatives. They tend to push for change. And within Māori mythology, they're referred to as the pōtiki. Now, we need both of these forces. Within society, we're good? We need both of these forces. The traditionalists maintain the familiar, the predictable, the tried and true, whereas the creators and the disruptors bring fresh thinking, ideas and technologies into the world, but they can be dangerous at the same time when those ideas and technologies don't come off. And so we keep them in a balance, and society tends to move at a steady pace. Not so fast as to stabilise society, but to keep it moving and adapting. However, with the climate change, that pace of adaptation is required as much faster and is unprecedented and far faster than what society is comfortable with. And this is why we're starting to see pushback in our society today, particularly rollbacks around climate change and environmental initiatives in general. And this is the challenge the agricultural sector is facing. It needs to move really fast, to adapt fast. However, moving too fast is there risks emerge on that journey, and there's this potential to kill the golden goose, which is our agricultural sector that underpins our economy. So the question is, what is the solution? And when thinking this through, I thought of the quote by the science fiction writer William Gibson, who said, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." What he meant by that is that the solutions exist in pockets, but they're not widely known, and they're not adopted or validated. And to me, introducing certainty into this uncertainty involves finding where these new and novel technologies, ideas and models and processes sit, and then validating them and then spreading them rapidly through the agricultural sector. Although there's lots of areas of innovation, three stand out to me. The first is around environmental governance and catchment management. And we're seeing a whole range of catchment groups across the country that are bringing together iwi, farmers, councils, science and industry to transform farming practice, to think long-term and resilient. And Te Ao Māori is playing a huge role in this, particularly bringing interconnected ways of thinking, kiuti ki tai, mountains to the sea approaches, kaitiaki stewardship values. Examples being Taranaki Maunga project or the Waiwanaka project. Others are on farm. We're seeing some of our leading Māori land trusts and corporations leading on the front of both technology, environmentalism and profit. And how can we draw on them, and they're drawing on the latest science, technology and models. How can we learn from them? How can we extend that? We're also seeing the innovation on farm with regenerative farming practices and so on. How can we draw upon those and spread that across the country? And finally, in the lab, the scientists, the engineers, the modelers, how are we bringing them together, and how do we identifying those key ideas and spreading them? So from my perspective, it's like thinking like a network. Where are all the nodes in the network? Where are all the innovations happening? Where are the problems being solved? How do we validate those, and how do we rapidly shift those, take those ideas and rapidly shift them across the agricultural sector?
Yeah, kia ora koutou. As Andy said, I don't have a background in the land and food system. I have a background in conservation, and you may think that that doesn't fit, but it does actually fit really well. When I was at the Department of Conservation, we started to see things, impacts here and now that we hadn't seen before. We could see that our small mammal pests were getting worse, and it was likely because of climate change. They were turning up in cold ecosystems, and this was a problem. So we weren't really prepared, and the issues were already here. And we had a real lack of foundational information to actually look out and see, okay, what do we need to do? And it was across the entire system. And looking out wider, you can actually see that the things that were impacting the conservation system and our biodiversity are actually impacting land and food sector as well. There's pests, there's ecosystems under pressure, there's lack of water, drought, fire, flooding, all those things that impact conservation systems impact the land and food sector as well. And so these are big grunty issues, and as we've heard this morning, we can't work on these things alone. So what do? We need that foundational information, and we all need to be working on the foundational information so we can work out how to adapt. And we need to consider a whole of system approach, really. And that's tricky, because the other thing we've heard here this morning is that it's hard to work together, it's big, and it's transformative is what it is. But the issue with transformation is, I think it's really hard to see transformation when you're looking forward. I think transformation is something you see when you're looking back, but what you see when you're looking forward is a whole lot of small steps, and you need to follow those steps, and we all need to work on it together to get to the end point. And probably in line with that is my final point, which implementation is hard for that reason as well. It is really hard to implement climate adaptation. There is multiple reasons for this, but research, foundational information is key to getting there.
Thanks, Judy. Ron.
Thank you. I just wanted to add a few points, if I may, to give you a sense of where I think we're at in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We, particularly in agriculture, the sector here is making exactly the same classic mistakes that pretty much every sector is around the world, which is believing that somehow the future is some kind of continuation, but although modified from the present. And secondly, letting current vested interests dominate the debate. So we do have some great innovators here in agriculture, but that's not they have a limited impact, and they're up against these massive forces of vested interests and current practice. So I think the default position in New Zealand agriculture is that we're already the best. It's telling itself, farmers are telling themselves, we're already the best in the world, very low emissions per kilogram of milk solids or meat, and therefore it's up to the rest of the world to catch up with us. However, this completely ignores that where this is going globally is about huge revolutions in land use and farming systems and food, and we are ignoring that here in New Zealand. We're just not taking that on board. How might we change this? I think we've got to do a much better job of connecting the true creators and disruptors, to borrow from John, that we have here in New Zealand and overseas, to help them connect better with the mainstream here, and to offer as much encouragement and carrots as we possibly can, but at the same time we've got to be very clear to admonish and let reality tell it as it is, and with some sticks if necessary. But I want to add one last point, and it's a bit rude of me to take a theme of this day, but then wanting to push it out much further. So let me take possible. That is not a strong enough word, because possible is like, oh, that might work, or we could do that. We've got to start with the essential things, the things we've got to do. So we've got to be doing the essential, not discussing what's possible. Then the next step was what's plausible, what could possibly be done. But again, that has to be pushed out to the extraordinary, because that's how is how radical the change needs to be. And then the last one was preferable. We have these choices, so which would we prefer to do? Actually, we've got to think about this not just about plausible, but existential. So, so it's very rude of me to tamper with the theme of the conference, but to me it's about essential, extraordinary, and then existential. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod. So please keep popping your questions into Slido, but also if you see a question that you think really needs asking, vote it up, because that makes it rise to the top of my list. But so to start off the conversation, I mean, you've all talked to, and we've heard before morning tea, about the complexity and the interconnectedness of different systems and lenses. So, and that includes interconnectedness of knowledge and governance, and questions about, so at the catchment scale, you may well identify how regenerative practices would foster greater resilience. How do we scale this up? How do we actually bring this to the attention of those who are several steps removed from catchments and yet ultimately make decisions? So John, you talked about the very strong and positive experiences we see at catchment scale. How can we scale this out from there? But also keen to hear from others who all talked about the need to have a systems approach. How do we actually do this better, stronger, especially when it gets to scales where you have lots of different moving parts that have to actually move in the same direction to achieve that systematic scaling up? But maybe, John, if you want to start.
I think there's been a revolution in the area of remote sensing and artificial intelligence, which can give us very high resolution information of what's happening at a farm scale across the country for relatively small investments. What that can tell us is, if you think of a traffic light system, those that are green might be doing very well, those who might be amber, those who might be red. If we can identify the green lights across the landscape, that gives us a much better idea of who's doing what, where, who to learn from. So I think that's the key thing. One is getting the detailed information required to make those shifts and transformations. I think that dovetails simultaneously with the ability for catchment level planning. I think catchment level, regional, national planning, spatial planning particularly, I think some of the technologies there provide a basis for integration, for making sense of these different systems and how they interconnect. So I think technology has a huge part to play in taking the information from the ground and taking it up to the policy level for that type of decision making. But of course it also requires, like I was talking about before, transformation of minds and how fast people can move. So you need trusted communities, people that trust others within their community, or trusted catchments to learn from others. So there's trust alongside that, as well as the technology enabling that.
Yeah, I think that just adding to John's point about technology, in order to scale adaptation up, in order to scale transformational change, in addition to technology, it's people. We need to enable communities to decide the future for themselves. We need to build capability and capacity within communities, within sectors, to scale that up. There are simply not enough consultants or scientists to do the job. And it is going to be then changing how we do adaptation planning. And as Anne talked to, it is a process. So can we recast it as a learning process so that, so that MFE is doing its scenarios to test policies against, that communities are working collaboratively across water, infrastructure, the primary sector, to determine what kind of future they want and chart a pathway to that and scale that up beyond the catchment. So I think in addition to technology, it is about building that capability and capacities within communities, within sectors, to do this for themselves.
So to what extent are efforts for communities to do themselves constrained by a mindset of boundless economic growth, in the sense there's a think of Lauren's picture, there's a bigger risk-escape driver. If that path is already set in stone in the sense of some of the overarching decision makers, what flexibility do communities, catchments have to actually implement those changes? To what extent is that a real constraint? But then again, you can't do away with that constraint easily because you do have to pay the bills, and sort of it's the old, very hard to be green when you're in the red. So how do we square that circle?
I think debt's a huge issue across the sector. So attracting finance for the transformation is essential. Impact investment, sustainable finance. That comes once again, particularly being able to invest in, say, biodiversity or carbon. That requires measurement to verify those elements so that farmers on the ground can be paid to do a lot of the resilience or nature-based solutions required for that adaptation to occur. So I think, once again, there's some technology involved in this and attracting international investment capital to be able to generate those transformations on the ground. So, yeah, that would be one solution amongst many.
If I may just focus on one thing which I think is fundamentally important, is that we can't do many of the things we want to do unless we have a very fundamental reform of the RMA, which we've been working on very hard for a long time. And we're about to have a new government which says that its first act is going to repeal the Natural and Built Environment Act and the Spatial Planning one. So we've actually got to push incredibly hard with the new government to make sure that if they do repeal, they actually bring back this work that so many people have worked on so hard for so long back in a practical form. And then there's still lots more to build out from it. But that new framework there, I think, is going to be a huge driver of change and enabler of change, but we've got this political hurdle to clear right away.
One other thing, I mean, so John in particular talked about the complexity of data that is now available by remote sensing, etc., at farm level, and to use that to identify what works well, both within the individual farm, but also across farms within a catchment. But also then you've got data requirements for what ecosystems need that are bounding on or are part of productive farm landscapes. Do we have the capacity to actually shape pictures that then resonate with people who don't have a technical background? So there's a technology-led side to identifying problems, solutions, and making decisions. But some of our decision makers aren't exactly blessed with strength in technological skills and training. How do you see that working in practice?
Is it that the climate change that is impacting on our land system is going to impact on the food system? So it's what is available in the supermarkets for people to eat in those urban areas. And I think that is perhaps where the rubber will hit the road for that. You know, when people's, favourite wine isn't available or is a lot more expensive because of climate change. And that's where, and there'll be multiple examples of that. And I think that's where it comes through. And I just want to go back to and reflect on your how do we scale up. And I think it's really important that, that remote sensing at that farm level as well, is that sort of work, when it's done, there's an eye on it that looks like, how can we scale this up to a national level? Because we need that national level foundational information, and that is the sort of information that drives, government policy, government regulations, and those sorts of things occur at a national level. So it's really important that fine scale, detailed research can be scaled up.
Yeah, just an answer from my end around that. So you can have the same data being drawn in to understand the environment and communicating it to different audiences to meet their needs. I know from the Eco Index program that we spent 3 years simply working with farmer groups, with iwi, ministries and so forth to understand each of their logics, each of their language, the various forms of understanding and communicating, and then designing our specific tools for those audiences. And drawing common language, symbology, ways of thinking. And so those sort of things are important in that interactive way and for communicating this type of information.
So are our research institutions geared up to deliver that sort of knowledge and that sort of integration? basically, I mean, what have you learned in the National Science Challenges that might have been different, that has to be part of future research investment, but also how businesses can engage in facilitating research and implementation there, rather than assuming government funds research, knowledge emerges, people know what to do, world is a happier place, job done. That's not how it's working, is it? So what does it say about knowledge generation?
I think first of all, the current system, I mean, the purpose of the Aotearoa process is to look at the way we fund science, and that arguably the hyper-competitive model may be better served by much more collaboration. And I think that the fact that this is 3 national science challenges coming together demonstrates the fact that adaptation is it's complex, interconnected, and that it does require much less competition and much more collaboration. I think secondly, there's a very important role that, yes, the publicly funded science is playing in terms of providing research, but I also think that some of the impetus is also coming from the private sector. So, for example, the public-private partnerships like the Aotearoa Circle and their work on seafood sector adaptation and agricultural adaptation. But also, if you look more widely, the work around the greening of the financial system. And I think Jack will probably speak to that this afternoon. But, and one can pick apart various aspects of it, but arguably it is sensitizing businesses to the existential climate risks and how they are going to manage that. And that is also in turn driving new investment in research and in adaptation in trying to reduce those risks. So I do think that, more collaboration, but also acknowledging and supporting private industry's investment in these things.
Do we need new institutions on the more governance or decision-making side that supports that connectivity of researchers? Because I often feel that we load more and more onto researchers, so you have to do modeling, you have to do quantitative stuff, you have to publish papers, you have to engage with stakeholders, and often researchers feel like, I don't disagree with any of that, but frankly the day has only got 24 hours, and then you can work nights, and then still not enough. So are there other things that we're missing in how we populate the totality of decision-making that brings research into that space, that makes it more effective to actually support decisions by those who are in a position to make decisions?
Well, I think in any situation, you have different personalities. Some people prefer to be in a lab. Some people like being in contact with other people, engaging. Other people, like being on the ground, doing applied things. Like anything, you need a mix of that talent. You need people that are really into the research, but you also need people that are really good on the interface, particularly cross-cultural interface, those sort of engagements. So, anything. But our institutions don't divided according to, science here or engagement here or whatever. So we're kind of broken up. So it's that ability to create institutions that cover all of those bases would be optimal, including a heavy investment, again, in extension, extension work that we used to have to get knowledge out there.
If I may chip in one thought, I'm a great believer where possible in modifying and much improving existing institutions rather than constantly making new ones. And so as a business journalist, I'm fascinated by what's going on at a governance level. So, for example, the Institute of Directors here in New Zealand has finally got round to its Chapter 0 work and is getting really good take-up there. And I hope that would feed through very rapidly into getting people onto boards of companies that are much more climate literate and ambitious. But weighed against that, we've then got an organisation like AgriZero as a bunch of major vested interests and government money, which feels to me very bureaucratic and very focused on a few particular outcomes and is not systems thinking at all. It's looking for silver bullets, basically. I think that's a huge mistake. But I think we can achieve a lot more if we just focus on who's in governance roles and how well equipped they are to get existing institutions and organizations moving forward in a much more effective and faster way.
I'd just like to add that I think the New Zealand science system is well prepared, but it is about their interconnectedness, and it's that ability to speak the same language as decision makers and policy makers. And I often think about it like a football pitch, and it's in thirds, and at one end are the researchers, and they're doing their elegant research, and at the other end is the policy makers and or the decision makers, and they are making decisions. And in the middle, there's a really important piece, and it's information, and it's how do you turn the data from the scientists into usable information for the people who need to use it, and that is the crunchy bit. And sometimes it's almost like one end is playing netball and the other end is playing football. But and I think perhaps that is the challenge, is understanding each other's needs and what everyone needs. So it's those interconnected science roles are key.
Yeah, and it certainly takes time to do that, and standard research metrics don't reward it, and funding is hard to get for it out of a traditional science system, which again goes back to how do we become better at building an ecosystem where there is contribution from businesses, from various levels of local government to actually foster such communities and give them the time and the energy and the resources to breathe in that space. Maybe one thing I want to turn to, because we've been talking about what needs to happen and institutions, etc., and we keep forgetting that ultimately it's people, right? It's individuals. People are under stress, under pressure from various changes that are happening in the landscape, from a policy driver, from international drivers. And now if you look at all the complex transformational change, you're being told, unless you transform, you're going down the gurgler, but no pressure, mate, leave it to you because you're best equipped to handle this. How do we actually empower people to exercise the leadership at whatever level they operate in?
How do you give people a sense of agency in the face of, existential crisis? There's no easy answer, and that's, we saw this, most recently during COVID, the range of responses to scientific information, the way in which there was no longer a single metric for what was valid, and the challenge of trying to change behavior. Do you appeal to some sense of common good, to a collective humanity? Do you start implementing sticks and carrots? And they all come with consequences and trade-offs, some of which exacerbated existing social conflicts. So there is no easy answer. Instead, I think we do need to start thinking much less about silver bullets and much more about the range of solutions, about developing some sense. We're a small country, so there is an opportunity, I think, to have a national conversation on climate change. What is the future that we want? And then how do we get there? There is an opportunity to start providing simple but practical tools that people can start to understand what the risks are, what the options are, and then step those out over time to just, in a very practical way, help people navigate. And I think that can foster a sense of agency and control, and hopefully take things out of that it's all going to fall apart to I can do something about it.
But which I guess goes back to Jenny's point, like you don't do transformation, you don't get out of bed and say, today I will transform. You take one step at a time, and then you look back and say, well, we've come a long way. Other thoughts, comments on that space?
I think the key thing is to be able to reduce, like I talked about earlier, to reduce uncertainty as much as possible. And I think that's about having long-term plans, maybe 100-year plans. I know that when we're looking at biodiversity restoration on farms, the key feedback kept coming
back to us, we want to know where to plant and over what time period and how much it's going to cost us to meet our biodiversity targets. And so that became very simple. It's like, okay, well, what's a reasonable time period? How much of your budget every year to put aside for this? And so it's a, over a 100-year period of cross-generational way of thinking. That type of focus that you find a lot also among iwi and Māori is getting that long-term thinking in place with clear strategies of how we get there, with good science underpinning it, with modelling and ways of thinking that gives us clear strategies for achieving a long-term collective goal. But to do that, you do need high-level, regional, national, spatial planning that can come down to local scales that can inform people right on the ground. Once you've got that type of level of strategy, whether it's biodiversity, carbon, nutrients, or whatever it might be, then you have some sort of level of certainty, and certainty for investment, and certainty for funding, whatever it might be, that enables that change to happen over a period of time.
So what's our, picking up on the point that I think Jenny made before about, the rubber will really become visibly hitting the road if your favorite wine in the supermarket, if you're an urban consumer, is no longer available. So I guess my question is, what's our prospects for developing a national food system strategy that actually brings the communities, center to the conversation, rather than sort of have a big picture conversation that happens again in urban centers that sets national priorities and gives the opposite of certainty for how you can bring your agency to play to make your community more resilient, because there's a bigger picture being sorted out. How do we bring the reality of adapting in rural communities into a big picture urban conversation, and what that means from a systems perspective? Does that make sense as a question? I just feel like we're often pretending that there is a solution out there. We just need a national strategy and that solves the problem. And how do we best do that in a way that is responsive, that doesn't promise certainty where it doesn't exist, because the climate will keep changing on us and our markets will keep changing on us, and yet enables agency because you provide a context in which you can do your damn thing in the area that you have influence on.
I'd like to make one suggestion, if I may. I have long been a great fan of the Climate Change Committee in the UK because of its breadth of thinking and experience, but also the way it's established. Government has to pretty much do what it strongly recommends. There's some if, buts and ands around that. And so I think the Climate Change Commission here has done a fantastically good job in its short life so far in terms of being able to bring all these interdependent complex issues together and articulate a very clear way forward. And there's also been really good public buy-in in terms of feedback and submissions and all the rest. So I would love to see, I think what would be very helpful would be if we had an enhanced role for the Climate Change Commission and more consequences for a government for not following its advice. And then for the Climate Change Commission to be that place, because we only kind of need one in a small country like ours, that can be a repository, really of that integrated view and being engaging people in it in an apolitical way. I think that would be very helpful.
So
I know you've got
I'm a commissioner, I can't possibly comment on that other than to know that a food system strategy obviously is much, much wider than climate change.
Yeah.
And so it's exactly the question, how do we bring these multiple perspectives to bear, and what's an effective way? And so there's a couple of questions popping up on Slido. One is really, what's the role of businesses? And I really want to test that in the sense that it's clear that businesses play a vital role as part of supply chains, as part of what lands in supermarkets, different types of businesses. John talked about the importance of a multi-generational perspective, and yet that's not typically what many businesses make their priority. How do we better enable businesses to drive positive change while letting them do what businesses do, and which isn't often looking out the next 100 years?
Well, we've got some very big changes coming, and not the least of which is the climate disclosure regime is now here, and the nature one is not far behind. And I think those are going to, you can already see it on climate, and I'm confident it will happen on nature too, will be forcing major companies to think about these things very differently, and then that would have a sort of a cascade effect. So we've got some things in train which I think will start to shift perspectives.
Yeah. John? When we look at, for example, the Māori in the agricultural sector now making up around 25% of the sheep and beef sector, 10% of dairy sector, 40% of forestry sector. What you're seeing there is revolutionary kind of business models emerging. They're companies that are owned by communities, marae communities. They have to own up every year to an annual general meeting, and they have to report back on their environmental footprint to the communities, the nutrients going into their river. There's a deep emotional connection between what's happening in that business and the impact on the environment, on your whakapapa, and your connections to a place. That level of direct connection between the business and the environment is the key to that success in that sector, why it is being revolutionary and what it's doing. And so for me, I'm like, well, how do we replicate that level of sense of responsibility back to place in that way? Yeah, just food for thought.
Nick, did you want to add?
Just to say that, again, I think others have touched on it, that businesses are changing. They may not necessarily be changing for the same reasons, but shareholders are demanding that climate-related risks are accounted for in management strategies, so there is no disruption to supply chain. So your favorite wine will still be on the supermarket, so there will still be a return for your shareholders. Large multinationals like Nestle are setting emissions targets, which in turn will drive change in industry, in practice at the farm level. And while that's mitigation, it's still working towards building more resilient systems that are able to withstand shocks and stresses. So I think that there is definitely a role for business, and it is moving, however slowly.
So, but to pick up on the theme of transformation, if it turns out that you can only have your favorite wine on the supermarket shelf by investing heavily in irrigation, in things that keep the wine going to the supermarket shelf, but have massive trade-offs, how do we effectively have those conversations that make those trade-offs transparent and then allow businesses to operate within that space?
I don't think people fully understand the changes that are coming, and that's a big thing. And it's about working out how to communicate with them, and also what are the levers which will get them to change. What are the social levers? Many years ago, I was talking to one of the scientists out at Manaaki Whenua, and he made the point that he thought a lot of New Zealanders weren't that worried about climate change because they heard that it was going to be 2 degrees warmer, and they went, oh, that sounds wonderful, lovely. And but there's other changes which we know are not good, and the winters becoming frost-free aren't good for pests, which I've talked about. Wildfire, that is very bad. Drought, that's a problem. So it's about working out how do we communicate about climate change in such a way so it doesn't sound nice. I often tell people we should be talking about how we'll become the land of the long grey cloud. And instead something to motivate. But I think it's about finding where are those levers, and that goes alongside that. What small thing can we do that might make a difference? Which sounds, it is the baton of hope, really. And but it needs to go alongside, okay, where are those levers? Because that small thing could be a big lever, and you won't necessarily know if it's a big lever then and there. You will only know when you look back on it. And so I think those things all go together.
I'm just thinking, when you're mentioning the supermarket shelf, we're seeing multiple initiatives, happening internationally. There's so many assurance systems which, kind of guarantee the sustainability of a product. But those regimes are getting stricter and stricter and stricter. And so to the point where, certainly in the EU, and they're going to become trade barriers to New Zealand producers. Certainly what's seeing out, projected out to 2030, what we're seeing. So these assurance systems will become sort of more and more implicit, stricter, and the verification mechanisms will become much more accurate as the science goes along. So the ability to have a poor environmental footprint is going to reduce significantly, certainly over the next 5 to 7 years. So I think, from that front, I think that will, seeing what's happening and evolving internationally, that will start to take care of itself. But we're going to see prices increase, of course.
So I think that, that point of more and more stricter regulatory assurance schemes raised the question that I think we'll explore this afternoon, is about how does that not translate into an unmanageable regulatory burden for the individual farmers.
Yes.
If you have to, trace every single sheep before you can even share it, and have to demonstrate that it was shown in a humane manner, etc. So there's keen to explore this afternoon. Jenny?
Yeah, just the other thing about foundational information is that it will also tell us where there's opportunities and where there's opportunities to move those food sectors to. The Great West Coast Pinot Gris vineyard, since we're on the wine theme. It's where are those opportunities, and it's important to talk about them as well, because that's, that is part of the resilience conversation.
Yeah. So actually, there's one thing I want to ask, and it's sort of a little bit, it goes back to, we have a very data-rich background in our conversation, right? We assume that the best farmers, the best systems are more and more becoming data-rich. To what extent does that risk blurring the big picture? Like, you have so many pixels, and if you look at too many pixels, you see just pixels rather than the big picture that's in front of you. And I'm thinking back, a friend and colleague of mine many years ago used to say, look, if I need to have a conversation with a farmer about climate change, all I need to know is 2 degrees warmer, 10% drier, go. Because all the expertise rests on the farmer who's working on that land. Do you think that's changing because we're actually more sophisticated in the data that we can now have? Or is there still a risk that we are baffling people by multiple little inputs that disable them to just think for themselves and say, look, I've been on this land for years, generations, just give me enough for me to think into my own future and I'll make something of it. Is there a sweet spot? Are there multiple ways of doing this at the same time? Again, keen to talk about this afternoon, but from a researcher side, you're the ones who are able to provide the data. You thrive on data. How do you best package it up?
Well, I think there's always a gap between evidence and management, and that gap is tolerance for the consequence, really. And that's just, that gets bigger and it shrinks, and it's at community level, it's at council level, it's what climate change does to that gap. And it might be that, the farmers, the landholders are used to a gap like this, but actually with climate change, it's the tolerance is going to become a lot smaller, the impact's going to become a lot higher. But I'm just formulating this as I'm sitting here, which seems somewhat risky. But I think that it's about that tolerance gap between evidence and management and decisions.
I think farming's going to get more complex. Certainly from an agroecological perspective, it's not going to be a synthesis, more like the current systems. They're going to, there'll be ecologically minded type systems. So that in itself is going to be a massive learning curve. And I think but also with, we're talking about the complexity of data and information. But there's also opportunities to automate a lot of these things and to also be able to find ways to communicate them simply and in targeted ways to give guidance on what type of practice to do what and where. And I think this is where the whole area of artificial intelligence comes in, this ability to understand really complex things and give us reasonably simple outputs and instructions. So there's room in that area, I think. But there's also, of course, traditional ecological wisdom. We've got indigenous traditions to draw upon to think how systems operate. And those two are all bedded in practice in the way you operate, hands in the soil type way of thinking too. So there's all of those things fit together, I think, in a way that's still yet to be worked out, but all solvable.
Are we managing to extract enough of that lived experience of data, if you like, that don't fall into traditional concepts of data and data points? I mean, which is, I guess, partially what Mātauranga Māori also is struggling with to be seen, to be recognized as this is relevant knowledge here, just because it's not packaged in the way that many researchers are trained to think about it.
Yeah, well, that knowledge is there. I mean, from understanding the changes in patterns of a season to the presence or absence of a particular species, understanding what action's happening on the ground and the subsequent consequence. I mean, there's hundreds of years of trial and error learning and experience and so forth sitting there that can be drawn upon and to inform what we do today. And of course, we've got our own, New Zealand has its farming communities have their own traditions and knowledge system and learning from neighbours and so forth. So there, of course, there's that really embedded inherent knowledge, which is just really augmenting that, I suppose. And I think there's so much innovation that just happens at that, on that hands-on level. Yeah.
One of the big hopes I have is that one of the great achievements of the National Science Challenges, one of the great pleasures of following you all over the last decade, is the way people who have never worked together before have worked together from different organizations and dealt at a much more profound systemic level than ever before. So I know this is still under consideration about how to take this work on, but we've got to hold on to that in a way that we can increase that deeply connected systems thinking and make it very accessible to the people who need to make the change, but also make it very accessible and exciting to the population at large. And I have no idea how to do that, but I think that that's a real imperative to make sure that we are understanding that land use change and agriculture and food are in aggregate arguably the largest driver of climate change. And from that also flows a whole bunch of interdependent, interconnected things around economics and society and technology. It just goes on and on. This is really the heart of the work that you're doing in this you're all doing in this sector is really the heart of our climate response, of humanity's climate response. And we've just got to get people sort of really excited about that, and that we here in Aotearoa have, as I said, a fantastic responsibility, but opportunity to be deeply engaged in that and very effective.
Okay. We're coming close to having to wrap up this panel. There's one thing that, well, there's lots of things that leave me feeling like we haven't quite answered it. But one thing is that, so I'm hearing partially sort of the strong drive for a bottom-up approach to innovation, to change, building out from a catchment scale where you can have more or less complete, not knowledge, but a sense of what's going on, what the options are. You can trial different things. And yet we need a sort of a national level system direction setting to enable the experimentation to occur, not be flying completely blind. And yet I feel somewhat uneasy that we haven't quite spelled out how those two meet. And so I'd be keen maybe as part of anticipating a wrap-up from each of you just to think about how do we bring those perspectives together? How do we empower a national level challenge to really be richly informed by that ground bottom-up experience? And how do we make sure that the local experiences can can be generalized into something that actually works at a national scale, that works from a business perspective, that works from the perspective of somebody who says, we're going to keep our export earnings somehow, otherwise all sorts of things are going to go to hell, and therefore just making less money for the sake of protecting the environment isn't going to work, because that shuts down hospitals. That having that rhetoric rather than evidence necessarily in mind, but how do we bring those perspectives together in something that actually gives a semblance of moving together, if not in harmony, at least with a greater degree of coordination than otherwise I think we're sometimes seeing. So maybe take that as a challenge to roll through as we wrap up this panel.
So I think, first of all, that the regional scale has the potential to be that sort of intermediary at a spatial level between the national and the local. And so how can regional and territorial authorities provide spaces for that innovation to happen? And honestly, and maybe it is something along the lines of the Land and Water Forum, and the way in which that facilitated and enabled conversations of national significance around how we manage freshwater resources to happen in multiple locations across the country and provide recommendations. And so I think, as Rod alluded to, the role of the Climate Change Commission is important, but again, I think at a regional level, that can, there's a role for regional councils and territorial authorities to provide that brokering role in facilitating that conversation.
Thanks, Nick.
I think leadership is the key. I mean, with certainly, if you're talking from a catchment scale, there's catchment group leaders who are doing incredible things. There's iwi leaders who are doing amazing things within their takiwā, their tribal territories and regions. These people have trust networks within their communities and down to, right down into the ground. So these people are exist in the in-between space. Often they're a volunteer, many times well underfunded, stressed sort of people. I think there's a lot of room to build and support their capacity to reflect and represent their groups where they're trying to create transformation in the ground, connecting with regional councils and at a national scale with ministries and so forth. I think they're kind of that key bridge.
Yeah, I can only really reiterate what Nick and John have said, is that it needs to be at multiple levels. You can't just have, that national and then the local scale. There needs to be steps in the middle, and there is a framework there for that, and that's regional councils and territorial authorities and iwi groups, and it's bigger than just that as well. I also think it's important, and we haven't talked about it so much here, is that we learn from what's happening internationally as well. We're a small country, which is a strength for us as well, but it's also a limitation, and it's really important we learn from other countries what lessons they've already learned and take that on board as well. We don't have to reinvent the wheel.
I think of this as a culture change, and we've got to move on from diffidence and all the rest. We've got to get an awful lot better at challenging and cooperating with each other, and each of us has to be able to come along and say, this is what I'm doing, and I feel very passionate about, this is the help I need. What are you doing? How can you help? We've just got to be far more direct with each other about how urgent and extensive these opportunities are. I just can't stress enough that the crises that we're dealing with here are very interdependent, and therefore when we think we're solving narrowly a climate issue, we're at the same time we're solving economic and social and other related issues at the same time. So we've got these interdependent crises that we can have to solve in all at once. That's a huge culture change for us. It's a huge culture change for humanity. I'm not picking just on us in Aotearoa, but that to me is at the heart of this.
Great. Thanks very much. I realized we've only touched the surface of many of those things. I've been doing my best to sort of try and reflect some of what's popping up on Slido. I think it's now time to break for lunch. You've done, so first of all, thanks for all our panelists.